Okay, here's our video today. And the video is common ancestry and how we are all related. We're all related. And I use Queen Nefertiti. And I could have used anyone, but I just decided to use Nefertiti. And we'll talk about how she is our grandma, in a sense. I can't even fit how much of a grandma she is. Let's get close to it. So, you have your grandma, then you have your great grandma, but she is our great, 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 and I can just keep going. Great, 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 great grandma. We're going back many years, right? Over 3,400 years. So we'll talk about that. So we'll just say she's our great grandma times 168. So do 168 greats, and then we'll share genetic information with Queen Nefertiti. Everyone on the planet. And so this is not a religious video. We're not talking about Adam and Eve here. It's a science video, and we're talking about common ancestry, and specifically just with Homo sapiens in this video. And I have other videos on pedigree charts you can look up if you wish. But let's make a pedigree chart. Let's get a clean page. We'll come back again to Nefertiti. And as you can see in the background, there's DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, which holds our code, our genes, what makes us us. So if we make a pedigree chart, I'll write up here pedigree. Just shows you and your ancestors. We'll make a simple one here. We're not gonna include any brothers or sisters or cousins because it'll get much complicated. So that's you, whoever you are. That's you, and that'll be the 0 generation. And then, of course, you have mother and father. So that would be, we'll put the number 2 there because you have 2 of them. And of course, we're just talking biologically now. We're not talking about any other parents that may not be biological, but they're still your parents. But we're just talking biological, just talking about genes here. And if we keep going on this pedigree chart, and let's just use one person. So that person, maybe this was the father, would have had, of course, 2 also. And of course, you would have had 4 grandparents, right? So we'll say the grandparents, the grand. And we'll just, of course, with just this line, we can have, that person's going to have 2 also. And you would have 8 great grandparents, great grands. And, as you keep doing this, it'll increase and increase and increase. And we'll just keep with this line. So this person will have 2. Now we have 16, and this person will have 2. And you can see we'll just keep going, and it doubles each time. So this will be 32. So if you think about this is your grandparents, your great-grandparents, your great-great, we'll say great-great-grandparents 2 times. And then 3 times we'll have great-great-great-grandparents. And you have 32. And just think of it, just keep going, how much people you have. Well, why don't we just do one more? So we'll just, and this person again, and again, we're not including anyone else, just this one line here. And of course, if we did it again, you would have 64 great, 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 great grandparents. So if we think of a generation of how many years this could be, let's say, and it could be different for different people, let's say it was every 20 years. Of course, it usually doesn't work out that way, but let's say it was every 20 years. So in this generation over here, that would be 120 years. But for you or for someone else, it could be more. So in general, if we say 20 years, every 20 years, that would be 120 years. You would have 64 great, 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 great grandparents. So I'll just keep that up for a minute if you want to digest it. So the formula, by the way, is all you have to do is you take a 2 and 2 to the nth power, and that's the exponent, and you just plug in the generation. So, for example, your parents would be 2 to the first generation, which would be 2. That shows you have 2. And then the second generation would be your grandparents, 2 to the second generation, which is 4, and so on. So let's say, let's clear this out. I'll clear it all out here. You can go back if you need to. Let's say if we're using the 20-year mark, we're going back every 20 years as a generation. Of course, this is not true. It could be different for all different people. But if you go back 20 generations using 20-year gap, 2 to the 20th power, you're going to get a big number. You're going to get 1,048,576 descendants. And those descendants, by the way, we're talking about every 20 years. We're talking in 400 years. So if you go back 400 years ago, you can have over 1 million descendants. Looks like we have a mutation. That should be an A. Fix that A there. So think about going back 1,000 years. This is where it gets really mind-blowing. You go back 1,000 years ago, 50 generations, 2 to the 50th power. Can't even write that number. So I'll just say it's going to be over 1 quadrillion descendants. It's a lot, but there's a problem. The population today, the population of the world today is over 8 billion. Nowhere near the quadrillion descendants you need to have. And if you go back 1,000 years ago, the population 1,000 years ago was only about 200 to 300 million. Nowhere near the quadrillion. So there's the problem. So what do you think the answer is? Where are all those descendants coming from if the population wasn't near that? And of course it comes down to inbreeding. It comes down to where your pedigree chart is overlapping. So your great-great-great-grandmother could also have been your great-great-great-aunt, and so forth, where second cousin marries third cousin, or where first cousin marries first cousin, which has been very common in history. Not many of us here, not many people know their fifth cousin. Do you? Do you know your fifth cousin? Let's look at a chart of that. All right, and we'll stick with yellow. So we'll make another pedigree chart just to show that here's you, and we'll have your parents and so forth, and we'll continue with one line. We'll have another one there. So there you have 2 parents and you have 4 grandparents, and of course we'll just keep going here. You have 8 great-great-great-grandparents. That is 16 great-great. So great-great-great. You have 16 great-great-great-grandparents. And for a fifth cousin, you would share one of these great-great-great-grandparents. So let's say, change the color, that one of these people in this line had a sister or a brother. And if you continue the chart this way, look at their descendants, their children, and that would be your cousin, your fifth cousin, which you probably don't know. So your fifth cousin shares a great-great-great-grandparent who had a son or had a daughter, and they followed this line. Very hard to know your great-great-great-grandfather. And remember, you have 16 of them. So it's very hard to know your fifth cousin. And if you do know your fifth cousin, you only share 0.2% of your DNA. It's insignificant what you share. So there's really no chance of mutations, even though the mutations could happen for other reasons. So it's very likely that people are marrying their fifth cousins or their sixth cousins because they don't know them. So you can see how a pedigree chart could overlap. So if we go back 1,000 years ago, forget 4,000 years ago, that's a whole other story. But if we go back 1,000 years ago and we think of someone who was living 1,000 years ago, well, we can think of someone like Leif Erikson. Leif Erikson was a Norse explorer. And the possibility 1,000 years ago of us sharing DNA with him is highly likely. In fact, everybody in the world highly possible that everybody in the world shares DNA from Leif Erikson 1,000 years ago. Clearly, anyone who has European descent probably share DNA from Leif Erikson. And of course, it would be very small DNA. Now, going back to Queen Nefertiti, who lived in 1400 BC, around there, everybody in the world, if you go back 1,000 years ago, well, let's just even say 2,000 years ago, if we go back 2,000 years ago, everybody in this world shares a common descendant. Everyone. And if you go back even further, Queen Nefertiti, you're looking at more descendants. So everybody in the world has a high likelihood of sharing DNA with Queen Nefertiti. And she would be, like we said before, our great-grandmother times 168. 4,000 years ago. And here she is with that headgear. Must be heavy. Grandma must be heavy. So, and by the way, the DNA is almost negligible. I mean, if I can get my pen working, I would have to put 0.000. I would have to keep going till I hit 50, at least 51 zeros. And then we'll just say 170, something like that. That's how much DNA we share for her. Nowhere close to 1% or 0.5% or 1/4% or 1/8%. Very negligible. Say that twice. Right. And of course, the pharaoh. What was the name of the pharaoh? Akhenaten. That's it. Lost my mind for a minute there. Even with him. So even though we can say that we share a common descent from someone over 3,000 years ago, doesn't mean that was the first person on Earth. No, not even close. And the concept of saying that we evolved from a common ancestor is monogenesis. And it's really not a common ancestor, it's a common population, which we'll talk about in other videos. So again, just to wrap up, everyone on this planet, Aunt Sally, Uncle Tim, whoever, from anywhere around the globe, if we go back far enough, even 1,000 years, we all have a common ancestor. And that common ancestor, of course, was not the first person on the planet. That common ancestor had parents also.